More stories from Grandma's Attic by Arleta Richardson, illustrated by Dora. Chapter 12. The Slate Pencil. Grandma called me from the yard. "Would you please go to the store for me? I'm ready to bake rolls and there isn't enough yeast. Take a quarter from my little change purse." I found Grandma's purse and put the quarter in my pocket. As I ran down the lane toward the road, it occurred to me that climbing over the fence and crossing the field would save some time, so I did just that. I was soon in the little general store that served our farming community. "Mr. Jenkins," I said, "Grandma needs some yeast." Mr. Jenkins set 3 cakes of yeast on the counter. His eyes twinkled and he smiled at me.
"And what do you need?"
I knew what he meant. I was always allowed to pick a penny candy when I came to the store with Grandma. But Grandma wasn't here and she hadn't said anything about spending a penny. "How much change do I have from a quarter?" I asked.
7 cents, Mr. Jenkins replied. "The yeast is 6 cents a cake."
I thought that over quickly. I would have a nickel and 2 pennies back. I was sure Grandma wouldn't care if I spent 1 penny, and if she was here, she might even say I could have them both. The longer I gazed at the candy display, the more certain I became that I needed 2 pennies worth as a reward for coming to the store alone. As Mr. Jenkins handed me the candy and the nickel, a twinge inside me said this was not a really honest thing to do. That wasn't my money, and I hadn't asked if I might spend it. Nevertheless, I put the nickel in my pocket and started home. This time I took the long way around by the road. "Thank you," Grandma said when I laid the yeast on the table. "Did you put the change back in my purse?" "Yes, Grandma," I replied, and hurried out to the porch. I hadn't really lied to Grandma, I argued with myself. I did put back all the change I had, but I had spent 2 pennies without permission. The second piece of candy in my pocket didn't sound like a good idea anymore. I knew I had deceived Grandma, and I was miserable about it. Later that morning, Uncle Roy came to the house for a glass of cold tea. He sat down beside me on the steps.
"Well, what have you been doing with yourself this morning?"
"I went to the store for Grandma, and since then I've just been sitting here." Uncle Roy looked down at me shrewdly.
"Something on your mind, is there?"
"I guess so. I'm thinking it over," I replied slowly.
"If there's something you should tell your grandma, I'd advise you get busy and do it."
He chuckled as he got up to leave.
"Chances are she knows about it anyway, and the kinder she is to you, the more miserable you'll be."
I watched Uncle Roy make his way back to the barn. He was right. Grandma loved me so much that I couldn't bear to keep anything from her. While Grandma took the hot rolls from the oven, I told her about the candy. She nodded when I finished my story. "I know just how you feel," she said. "We all feel like that when we've done something deceitful. God is so good to us and we can't help but feel bad when we disobey Him. I'm glad you told me about the pennies, and of course I'll forgive you." Grandma hugged me tight, and suddenly I felt as though a big lump was gone from my stomach. "I guess I should tell you about the time I took something that wasn't mine," Grandma said. "I was a pretty sad little girl, too, before it was straightened out." She buttered a roll for me, and we sat down at the table while Grandma told her story. I was still in the primary row at school, which was the first row of seats in our schoolroom. When the different classes recited, the boys and girls came to the front of the room and sat on benches. A lot of the time when I had finished my numbers or letters, I listened to the older ones read or talk about geography. One day I happened to be watching when one of the big boys stood up to recite. A slate pencil dropped out of his back pocket and rolled under the bench, but he didn't hear it. I was sure he would miss it when he sat down and begin to look for it, but he didn't. The class finished reciting and went back to their seats, and the pencil stayed there. I wanted that pencil. We only had a new one once a year, and I thought it would be a good idea to have another in reserve. I knew that it was wrong to steal, but if I happened to find something, surely that was all right. After a few minutes, I slipped out of my seat, picked up the slate pencil, and quickly put it under my pinafore. The rest of the day I kept telling myself that I had found it, so it was mine. That evening we sat around the table after supper. Reuben and Roy were doing their homework, and I pulled the pencil out of my pocket to write on my slate. Roy's sharp eyes didn't miss anything. "Where did you get that new pencil, Mabel?" "I found it," I glanced at Ma to see if she had heard. Of course she had. "Where did you find it?" she asked me. "Oh, around school," I replied. I lowered my head and didn't look at the family. "Did you ask who lost it?" Ma persisted. I shook my head. "You must do that," Ma said. "If no one claims what you find, then you may keep it. But you have to try to find the owner." I kept my head down, but I nodded to show Ma I understood. What would she think if she found out that I knew who the pencil belonged to? The evening seemed to stretch out a long time before Pa reached for the Bible to have prayer. As he often did, this evening he read from Proverbs. I was busy thinking about how I might continue to keep the pencil if I asked only a few children I knew hadn't lost it, when suddenly I heard what Pa was reading.
"He who makes a fortune by telling lies runs needlessly into the toils of death."
I didn't understand all that meant, but I knew what a fortune was, and I certainly understood telling lies. To have these things mentioned as running into death caused me to think. I hadn't lied, had I? No, but I had kept back the truth, and I knew Ma considered one as bad as the other. All at once the slate pencil didn't seem like such a treasure to me. "Ma," I blurted out, "I know who the pencil belongs to." Roy looked at me with horror.
"You mean you stole it?"
I began to cry, and Pa took me on his lap.
"Suppose you tell us all about it, Mabel."
As best I could, I told them about finding the pencil, and even about my plans to keep it. I was sobbing harder with each word I spoke.
"Don't cry, Mabel,"
Pa said as he hugged me tighter.
"God is ready to forgive us when we are sorry we've done wrong. Would you like to ask him to forgive you?"
"Yes," I said, and I knew I would be forgiven. The hardest part was to take the pencil back and ask the big boy to forgive me. But it was worth it to have a clear conscience. Grandma went back to work, and I thought about her story. I agreed. It was a good feeling to be forgiven. End of chapter 12.